So my talk will be on Reinhold and Schiller, and at the beginning I will refer to some points that we have already heard yesterday, also today, concerning Kant's philosophy. So let me first start with some remarks on the occurrence of the word Trieb in German literature from 1600 to the year 2000. So we have this Google Ngram viewer, which is very helpful, because there you can see a peak around the year of 1800. You see that there are so many occurrences, relatively speaking, of the word Trieb compared to older and younger literature. So there's a great interest in this topic around 1800. But I wanted also to say something about the conceptual field of Trieb, because as we have heard yesterday, there are similar concepts around this conception of a drive. So on the one hand we have power, force, then we have incentive. Sometimes Triebfeder is translated in terms of incentive. Then we have motivation, or motive. We have also intention. I think Professor Weibel referred to this point. We have intentionality in a way. Then we have striving. We also have inclination. And we have the will. And spontaneity is also a candidate for drive. And it's not the same, but it's in the same field, I would say. And so on. There might be others as well that we could include in this list. Let me first start with Kant's conception of drive and driving force, Triebfeder, as I translate it, and the context of his anthropology and metaphysics of drive. I will then proceed to Reinhold and the duality of drives. I mean, Professor Zöller referred to this duality today. And finally, I will discuss Schiller's trinity of drives, because he has not only two drives here, he knows three drives, and I will try to analyze the relationship between these three kinds of drives. And I will also refer to more recent literature in analytic philosophy and to compare these conceptions. So my thesis is that we can better understand the philosophical term drive in the concept of a theory of individual freedom and will, of autonomy and heteronomy. I think that this conceptual context is very helpful to understand the development of the conception of drive after Kant. Perhaps even before, but at least in Kant and after Kant. And when it comes to Reinhold and Schiller, we can better understand their theories, their conceptions of drive, if we compare them with Kant's conception of Trieb, drive, and Triebfeder, driving force. So in relation to Kant, they become more clear. Let me start with Kant on Trieb and Triebfeder. First, his conception of drive. So how to translate Triebfeder? I referred to this question at the beginning. So there's incentive. This is a candidate. There's motive. There's spring, sometimes in terms of the clock. And then there is driving force. And I personally prefer driving force. So I will, in what follows, I will also always refer to a Triebfeder as driving force. There might be even other translations, but I prefer driving force. So Kant uses the terms drive, Trieb, and driving force, Triebfeder, in various different contexts. Especially when it comes to the notion of drive, anthropology. This is especially important. So I have some quotations, some occurrences of drive. He speaks of the drive for science, Trieb zur Wissenschaft. This is certainly an anthropological germination. Then we have the drive of ambition, der Trieb zur Ehrsucht. Then in his religion, I think Professor Heidemann referred to this in his talk yesterday, we have the predisposition to animality, and here Kant speaks of two drives, namely social drive, Trieb zur Gesellschaft, and the sexual drive, Trieb zum Geschlecht. These are, of course, anthropological conceptions of the drive. Then we can ask, what is a driving force? Yeah? Manja referred to this distinction between drive and driving force. And when it comes to the driving force, Triebfeder, it's quite different because, as I shall argue, Kant does not develop a systematic account of Trieb, but only of driving force, not of drive. Drive is just an anthropological determination and has nothing to do with his metaphysics of the will or of morality. So here he speaks very broadly of the driving force as the inner determining ground of the will, and he also says the driving force, Triebfeder, is the subjective determining ground of our will. When it comes to his metaphysics of morals, generally speaking, and his autonomy of the will, his use of driving force becomes more systematic. So here he speaks of the difference between the pathological driving force and the moral driving force. Similarly, he says there is the moral or pathological driving force of the actions. So he clearly distinguishes between two kinds of driving forces. When it comes to nature and heteronomy, Kant says that the driving force is the driving force of nature, Triebfeder der Natur. This is heteronomy, not autonomy. This is from outside, in a way. Also, he says the pleasant, as the driving force of desires, is always of the same kind. Das Angenehme ist als Triebfeder der Begierden durchgängig von einerlei Art. Everything belongs to the same kind of Triebfeder if it's not autonomy, if it's heteronomy. There might be different phenomena that belong to the same driving force of nature. Okay, then we have, on the other hand side, we have reason and autonomy when it comes to this distinction between these two kinds of driving force. And here Kant speaks on, he has a chapter, as you know, in his second critique, the third chapter, Hauptstück. It's entitled On the Driving Forces of Pure Practical Reason. It's not the driving force of pure practical reason, it's the driving forces of pure practical reason. So we can ask, are there different driving forces of pure practical reason? As you all know, it's the moral feeling of respect, but the question still remains the same, why he speaks of the driving forces. Isn't there only one driving force, namely respect? So this is a big question. Über die Triebfedern der rein praktischen Vernunft. And then he says, in the same work, in the second critique, respect for the moral law is the sole and also the undoubted moral driving force. There's only one driving force. Okay, this is rationality, this is autonomy, compared to heteronomy and the driving force of nature. But as we can see, here are more concepts involved in this distinction, compared to his conception of drive. And now another important conception comes into play, namely his conception of the human will. And the human will is situated between these two driving forces. In his groundwork, he says, quote, the will stands between its a priori principle, which is formal, and its a posteriori driving force, Triebfeder, which is material as at a crossroads. And since it must still be determined by something, it must be determined by the moral principle of volition as such when an action is done from duty, where every material principle has been withdrawn from it. So the will is right in the middle, and it's the choice, Willkür, actually, to decide what shall be the determining ground of my will, either the formal or the material driving force. So this is the picture of, in Kant, very shortly, where Manja described it at greater length. And what I found interesting was that in Karl Christian Erhard Schmids Lexikon zum einfachen, leichteren Gebrauche der kantischen Schriften, his lexicon for the easier use of the Kantian writings, late edition in 1798, there we won't find any entry on the concept of the drive. There's only an entry for Triebfeder, as you can see here. Triebfeder. Elate animi. And here he distinguishes, like Kant did, between this formal driving force and the material driving force. Here, this is the material, the Sinnlichkeit, sensibility, and here is the driving force of reason, pure practical reason. So I found this very interesting because he obviously thought that he should not discuss the concept of drive in his lexicon. So let's proceed to Reinhold and the duality of drives. In his 7th letter on the Kantian philosophy, he had an interesting title. It's entitled About the Previously Unrecognized Difference Between the Unselfish, Uneigennützige, and the Selfish, Eigennützige drive, and between these two drives and the will. So we have the distinction between will, selfish drive, eigennützige, and unselfish, uneigennütziger Trieb. So how does he analyze this distinction? So he says that this is a very important distinction. He says that this is a difference from which, once it has been admitted, all the basic doctrines and subsequent clauses in that account result. So it's, so to speak, the basic, the key distinction for his philosophy. And there's an interesting thing because there's a drive theoretical reformulation of the categorical imperative in Kant that leads Reinhold to the following ready definition within the framework of his transformation of Kant's doctrine of autonomy. He says, this is his notion of the categorical imperative, drive theoretically explained. He says, in all your action of will, the satisfaction or dissatisfaction of your selfish drive be subordinated to the demand of the unselfish one. This is how Reinhold understands the categorical imperative in terms of his distinction between the selfish and the unselfish drive. So you see that has almost nothing to do with the Kantian notion of the categorical imperative, because there is no drive involved. This is just a formal principle, the categorical imperative. And here it seems to me that this is a material, or rather a more concrete definition that Kant would not have agreed with, I think. But it's interesting. And here's another quotation. He says, the demand of the selfish as well as the unselfish drive are prescriptions which are given to the person, one by pure practical reason, the other by theoretical reason, mediated by pleasure and displeasure. So here Reinhold links the distinction between these kinds of drives to a distinction within reason. So they are, the selfish drive refers to theoretical reason, hypothetical imperatives, what do I need to do in order to get to this goal, and pure practical reason, which is the unselfish drive. I found that very interesting. So he not only analyzes the categorical imperative in terms of drives, but also the capacity of reason, pure practical reason, and merely empirically conditioned hypothetical reason, so to speak, in terms of drives. So the distinction of drives becomes very crucial in Reinhold. Whereas in Kant, drive was just an anthropological notion, not very systematically elaborated, in my opinion, but we can discuss about this. So it becomes really important for Reinhold. So also he says the demands of the two drives of the selfish and unselfish are called the driving forces, Triebfedern, of the will, in how far they are engaged in the arbitrary satisfactions or dissatisfactions of the desire. So now he links the conception of drive to the driving forces. So he brings it then together, what Kant did not do. Yeah. So I found this very interesting. Another quotation, the will is divided into two original. This is quite similar to Kant's passage in his groundwork, where he said that the will is like at a crossroads. So this refers to this quotation in Kant's groundwork, as I think. He says, the will is divided into two originally essentially different and essentially united drives, Triebe, of which one founded in sensuality has pleasure as all as object, the other, present in personal self-activity, establishes a law necessary only by itself. This is pure practical reason in a drive theoretical description. What is important, I think Professor Zöller referred to this fact, Reinhold does not conceive of the will as something which has lower and a higher appetitive faculty. So he thinks that both drives are on the same level in a way. He says that the selfish and the unselfish drives are both possible motives of freedom. Quote, the two drives must of course be present in every willing, wollen, and are, because without them no will is conceivable, reasons, Gründe, and because the objects of will are determined by them, objective reasons, objektive Gründe of the will. So I think that there's always rationality involved. I found that very interesting. So this is a sort of a reasons account of freedom. There are passages in Reinhold where you could say this is just arbitrary indifference, mere choice, but here he speaks of reasons. So there are reasons involved that we can deal with. We can reflect upon them. So the drives are a sort of reasons or objects of reflection, of willing. And then there's another interesting point I found, which I shall call Reinhold's compatibilism in a way. He says, in moral action, absolute practical necessity and freedom are united insofar as the absolutely necessary law, i.e. the effect of practical reason, is executed by choice in a given case, and insofar made the effect of freedom. In the immoral action, natural necessity and freedom are insofar united as the requirement of the selfish drive, which is only in accordance with the laws of nature of desire but contradicts practical law, is carried out by choice and is insofar elevated to the effect of freedom. So he tries to bring together the necessity of the moral law, in a way, the constraint of the moral law, and the necessity of the what Kant calls the natural driving force. And he says that both driving forces are compatible with freedom. So it's not just the case that in determining us, for example, by being determined by the driving force of nature, we should be heteronomously determined. No, there is the possibility to have them combined with freedom to be compatible. I found this very interesting. I will proceed to Schiller and the trinity of drives. So already in his dissertation from 1780 at the Hohe Karlsschule in Stuttgart, Schiller dealt with the conception of a drive. So his aim was to give a history in this dissertation of the individual and to analyze, quote, how all his mental abilities develop from central drives. I found this interesting because it was very early. And now in his aesthetic letters, the human will is divided first into two drives, which exhaust the concept of humankind. First we have the material drive, Stofftrieb, and he describes it as follows: by matter, in this context we understand nothing more than change or reality that occupies time. Consequently, this drive demands that there shall be change, that time shall have content. On the other hand side, there's another drive, form drive, Formtrieb, which he describes as follows. It, the form drives, wants the real to be necessary and eternal, and the eternal to be necessary, and necessary to be real. So they are in a way complementary to each other. But they are not the only drives. As I said before, there's a trinity of drives. And here Schiller gives a sort of justification for introducing his conceptions of drive. He says, quote, I have no hesitation to use this term, namely drive, collectively, both for what pursues the observance of a law, the form drive, and for what strives to satisfy a need, the material drive, even though one otherwise tends to restrict it only to the latter. Just as rational ideas become imperatives or duties as soon as they are placed within the limits of time, so these duties become impulses as soon as they are related to something specific and real. This drive, namely the form drive, arises necessarily and is not absent from the one who acts against it. Without it, there would be no morally evil and consequently no morally good will. So both drives are always included, even in evil action. So it's just about the order. We find a similar thought in Kant, subordination of maxims. It's quite interesting, but of maxims and not of drives. And here, what is important for Schiller is that both drives are not separated. He says that they must refer to each other. They must stand mutually in a relationship of subordination. Quote, both principles are thus subordinated and coordinated to each other at the same time, i.e. they stand in interaction. Without form, there is no matter. Without matter, there is no form. This is a complementary conception of the drives. And in opposition to Reinhold, who had a rather static notion of these drives, Schiller has a genetic one, which I shall call an evolution theory of freedom, that is based on his distinction of drives. He says, the sensual drive awakens with the experience of life, with the beginning of the individual, the rational with the experience of the law, with the beginning of the personality. And now, only after both have come to existence, Dasein, its humanity has arisen. Also, he says, another quote, in the priority of the sensual drive, we find the insight into the whole history of human freedom. Freedom only begins when man is complete and his two basic drives have developed. This is a genetic model of human freedom that is enabled by his conception of drive. Here we find in the next quotation, we find a kind of critique of Kant's transcendental philosophy, which reminds me a little bit of Hegel. He says, Schiller, quote, in a transcendental philosophy where everything depends on liberating the form from its content and keeping the necessary pure from everything that is accidental, it is even easy to get used to thinking of the material merely as an obstacle and to presenting sensuality because it stands in the way of this business in an inevitable contradiction with reason. So he says, both need to be coordinated. The one cannot be without the other. They are intertwined in a way. And finally, we have the play drive. And here the question arises, what role does it play? Once Schiller said that both the material drive and the form drive exhaust human nature. So why should there be another drive? Is it an additional drive? I don't think so. Drive it emerges out of both the material and the form drive. He says the play drive, Spieltrieb, then, as in which both basic drives work together, will necessitate the mind, Gemüt, at the same time morally and physically, thus because it abolishes all contingents, Zufälligkeit, it will also abolish all necessitation and set man both physically and morally free. So this is a kind of negative freedom. So we have on the one hand side, we have the physical necessitation by the material drive, and then we have the, so to speak, rational determination by the form drive. And this is not the only status that condition in which the play drive sets the human being, because here Schiller stresses the harmony of the will. He says, quote, it is to be regarded as a state of supreme reality, the play drive, inasmuch as one pays attention to the absence of all barriers and to the sum of the powers acting in it collaboratively. You all know this very famous passage. He says, man only plays here when he is in the fullest sense of the word a human being, and he is only fully a human being when he plays. So what do we need to understand of playing? It's not just gambling. I think the English language has more expressions for Spiel. It can be a game, gambling, a play. So what does Schiller mean? Does he mean a play, I don't think so. I think it's actually a game. I think it's like a football game, because there are, on the one hand side, there are rules, so it's not just something arbitrary. There are rules in a game, and there's, on the other hand side, there's a sort of freedom to fill these rules or to act within the framework of these rules. And I think that's what Schiller has in mind. Freedom needs to have rules, restrictions, certain determinations, and some contingency, some Zufälligkeit, and bringing both together might set us free. Also in this quotation here above, he says, play is not a limitation, but rather an extension of man. Erweiterung, Ausweitung. So, as I said before, freedom is a very crucial term when it comes to Schiller's, also Reinhold's distinction of these drives. Schiller says, in playing, both the material coercion of the laws of nature and the spiritual coercion of the laws of morality are sublated in a higher concept of necessity from which true freedom emerges. So I think that the play drive is nothing additional. It's not a capacity, something like that. Not on the same ontological level than the form drive and the material drive, but it's rather the product of their interaction. It emerges when both drives, basic drives or first order drives, are in a very harmonious state. And during this harmony, first order harmony, a second order emerges. And this second order drive is what Schiller calls the play drive. So it's on another ontological level, not on this basic first order level. I would interpret so. So it's not on the same level. It's something that emerges out of the first order drives. And he says, as I said, there freedom emerges, and he describes this kind of freedom as a necessity, a higher concept of necessity. We also find this conception of a higher necessity in Schelling, as we might hear later. So I think that Schelling might have referred to Schiller in this point. Yeah? And there is not only Schelling who found this interesting, because Schiller said in his Kalias, there's an interesting term, namely autonomy versus autonomy. He says in this Kalias Schrift, the perfect can have autonomy insofar as its form has been purely determined by its concept, but autonomy has only the beautiful, because only at this is the form determined by the inner being. So I think that his conception of play drive allows Schiller to develop a conception of individual self-determination, individual autonomy, so that an individual does not give himself a general law, but an individual law that is valid just for him, in opposition to the general capacity of pure practical reason and its autonomy. I think that's a kind of individual self-determination. And as I had said before, freedom as a higher necessity is also prominent in more recent theories of freedom. For example, Harry Frankfurt. I mean, it's already 25 years old. But still, he says, I believe that the most genuine freedom is not only compatible with being necessitated, as Kant suggests, it actually requires necessity. I do not share Kant's view, however, that autonomy consists essentially and exclusively in submission to the requirements of duty. In my opinion, actions may be autonomous whether or not they are in accordance with duty. Here's the question whether this is a correct interpretation of Kant, but I think it's in the same direction that Schiller goes, because there's another quotation. These constraints, Frankfurt argues, of volitional or higher necessity cannot be determined by conceptual or logical analysis. They are substantive rather than merely formal. They pertain to the purposes, the preferences, and the other personal characteristics that the individual cannot help having and that effectively determine the activities of his will. So I think that what Reinhold and Schiller tried to develop is a more individual concept of freedom that than Kant did, On the other hand side, they might have problems with arguing for an objective theory of morality, because they are just focusing on the individual. So they lose certain merits that Kant's theory had, in my opinion. But when it comes to individual freedom, I think that both Reinhold and Schiller are still of importance, if you see that also Harry Frankfurt, in his semi-compatibilistic theory, refers to such a conception of higher necessity. Okay, thank you very much.